Growing up, I lived in a small town in a heavily forested area. In around second grade, my best friend, who shall be known as Celia, began complaining to me about very strange things happening in her household. The first thing she pointed out to me was a small hole that was forming in the walls of her unfinished basement. The walls were made of a sort of brick block material, and the hole was forming in the mortar but expanding as if the bricks were crumbling. I remember asking Celia if her parents knew about this, and she said they weren't worried. Fast forward some odd years, and around 4th or 5th grade, the hole had only become larger over the years, and we could now fit a great deal of our arms into the hole. As far as my arm would go, we could not feel the end of the hole and could not explain why it would corrode deeper into the house but not get much bigger in girth. At this point, Celia also began telling me she could hear voices from her basement and that she believed most of it was coming from the hole. I never heard any of these sounds when I would visit her house, but considering we were only 10 years old when this happened, I totally believed her. We frequently had sleepovers on weekends, which is when I was usually exposed to all of the creepy things wrong with her house. Her family was kind of strange in the fact that they had an abnormal number of animals. They had at least 6 cats and dogs, a few rabbits, birds, lizards, snails, frogs, fish, etc. Around the time when she was hearing the voices, we began noticing that her cats and dogs would randomly disappear and be found later in the basement standing right in front of the hole. In all the years I knew her and her animals, they had never liked to be in the basement. It started to really scare us, and she was telling me that she believed there was something living in the walls that could move around her house, but the hole was one of their ways out. At this point in time, I believed her, but had never really seen enough proof to be as scared as she was. In school, she spent most of her time an anxious wreck, and the teachers and other classmates were really worried for her. It really seemed to me like her parents just didn't care or believe her. A lot of adults believed she was only anxious because of her much older sister having left for college. Now here's where we get to the really terrifying part. I was sleeping over at her house during the weekend of Christmas holiday. A slight note about Celia's room is that she has a huge collection of stuffed animals of all sizes, clearly because of her family's love of animals. Anyways, the first night we were sleeping in her bed, and when we woke up the next morning, we immediately saw that every stuffed animal, normally strewn about everywhere, was neatly arranged in a pile about 4 feet high. All the animals were facing us and staring right at us. I don't believe now, and didn't at the time either, that someone, or Celia, could have moved all those toys. I have always been an extremely light sleeper, and some of the animals were on top of a very large wardrobe. We both knew that whatever Celia believed to be living in the walls had to have been responsible for this. We put back all the animals very carefully and never told her parents. I sort of wished we had now. Since I was staying the entire weekend, we went again to sleep that night in her bed. We woke up at around the same time when it was still dark out. It must have still been the nighttime. We heard a very low creaking noise that was coming from underneath us. We both knew it was the wooden floors under her bed. Just like in a textbook horror movie, and probably because we were only 10, we thought it was a good idea to lean over the edge of the bed and look under. Right as we looked, we saw and heard one floorboard slam back onto the ground. We shot our heads back up and held each other and cried. I have never been so scared in my life and called my parents the next morning to take me home right away. I refused to ever go back to Celia's house in fear, and she only got worse at school and home. I don't remember if I ever continued to ask her about the things in her house. Maybe I didn't because I was too scared, and we were just so young. For unrelated circumstances, my family moved far away from that town that summer. I had only seen her twice after that, and that was over a decade ago. I have never heard from her since, but have always wondered what happened as I know her family still lives in that house today. So, this happened roughly a year ago. I live in a pretty old house with 5 other guys in downtown Kalamazoo, a fairly small city. I live in the historic neighborhood where all the houses are pretty close together, and I share a driveway with the house next to mine, which is actually 3 apartments. In the top apartment lived a woman who was probably in her mid to late 20s, was very nice, and always greeted me and my roommates when we were both outside. We had never really attempted to get to know her. We were always neighborly, but never really went out of our way to get to know her. One summer day when we were all sitting on the front stoop drinking beers and smoking a joint, the neighbor from the top apartment came down with her boyfriend and their friend just to stop and say hey. We ended up talking for a couple of hours and invited them in because they seemed pretty friendly. The entire time during the conversation outside, the boyfriend and friend seemed pretty shaky, and they were all pretty greasy looking, and their clothes were ratty, and their friend had half of his mustache shaved off. But when you live in Kalamazoo, people like that are really a dime a dozen, so we didn't think too much into it and just wrote them off as dirty hippies. Once we were inside, we started talking about jobs. Both the neighbor and her boyfriend were in between jobs, and their friend said that he was a chemistry teacher at a community college, which seemed pretty bullshitty to us, but we didn't call him out on it. So the night goes on, and the neighbor and her boyfriend leave, and the friend decides to stay. We continue talking, and the friend starts to get really into me. He is a gay man, which isn't a problem at all, but I'm not gay and didn't really want anything to do with him. He kept touching my thighs and legs and making me super uncomfortable by being super suggestive. I had music playing in my room just for background noise. Then at one point this guy goes into my room and just dances by himself for like an hour. Once he finally leaves, I lock my door and leave the house because I felt too uncomfortable to stick around. I go to a friend's. When I get back, my girlfriend came with me as well. I talk to one of my roommates, and he tells me that the guy just got stranger. Eventually, they had to kick him out because he kept insisting on getting a hug from one of our lady friends, and she refused, so my roommate told him to get out. We all go to bed around 1 a.m. The next morning, around 7 a.m., my roommate is going downstairs with one of our friends that slept over. He wants to make a sandwich and can only find a big bread knife. It had been a while since we had done the dishes, and walks into the kitchen, where the door to the basement also is. As he gets into the kitchen, he saw the friend guy standing at our front door. The guy freaks out a bit because my roommate is holding a fairly large knife. My roommate asks him why the hell he is standing in our kitchen, and he replies with that he got locked out, so he came into our house to sleep in the basement. After hearing that, my roommate tells him to get the hell out, and he does without hesitation. We then call the cops to make a report. A little later, we go down into the basement, and on the floor is a message written in chalk from the guy apologizing for sleeping in our basement, along with some creepy drawings and the phrase, "living dead boy." The message also contained both me and my roommate's names, which also kind of freaked us out. He had slept there the entire night and none of us knew. The cops came and took our info, and as that was happening, the neighbors came down from their apartment and were shocked that we called the cops, and I said something like, "Of course we called the cops. Your friend broke into our house." Nothing more ever happened with the police. The people ended up moving out in a couple of months and we never saw them again. My landlord also owns their apartment and told us that when they moved out they left the place trashed, and he found a bunch of used needles and other paraphernalia. We were less than shocked. This happened to me in late December of 2007 when I was about 8 years old. It was probably one of the most horrific moments of my entire life. Well, to start off, it was Christmas time. I remember getting up early and opening my presents with my parents and my twin sister. One of my presents was a Simpsons movie figurine combo set. It was basically a set of character figurines from The Simpsons. It also contained the Simpsons movie. Now, before you say anything about an 8-year-old watching The Simpsons, I'll have you know my dad was a complete fan of the series. He literally bought every season and volume of it, and we would watch it together. Fast forward 2 nights. I believe this occurred on December 27th. I can't really remember crystal clear on what happened that day, but I can only remember the events that occurred at night. My parents had put us to bed, and for some reason, my sister and I could not sleep. Since I couldn't sleep, I snuck into her room to talk and play with toys. Now it had gotten pretty late past our bedtime, about maybe 11:45 a.m. Soon my sister and I got bored. I remember her having the idea to go into my parents' room and crash there and watch the Simpsons movie on their TV. We both agreed it would be a great idea considering that we knew they were deep sleepers and they snored. We also knew they wouldn't mind us sleeping in their room. So my sister and I turned off all the lights in our rooms and headed for our parents. The most prominent thing I can remember that night was how cold it was. At the time, we lived in an old Victorian house that did not have AC. Another thing I remember is how eerily pitch black it was when we turned off all the lights before entering the long hallway. I was not a big fan of the dark back then. In fact, I had trouble sleeping in my room, let alone with the light off. When we entered our parents' room, we turned on the TV and set up the movie. I brought my blankets and got bundled in. About 45 minutes into the movie, I heard the basement door downstairs slam shut. Now, our basement door is pretty thick and heavy. It takes a lot of force to slam, I remember just sitting still, full of fear and terror and having that uneasy feeling in your stomach. I felt like a deer that had seen headlights. After the door slammed, I heard footsteps coming down the hall. They sounded like a pair of heavy-set boots. My sister and I just sat still. Then the footsteps came near the stairs that lead upstairs. As soon as you come upstairs, the first room you would see would be my parents. So if this person came upstairs, the first room they would probably walk into was the room we were in. After that, I heard nothing. It felt like my sister and I were just laying there for hours. What really unnerved me most was that I heard footsteps, no doors opening or closing, concluding that they exited the house. I then remember grabbing the remote and turning off the TV and hiding under the sheets. It took me a while, but I finally fell asleep. The next morning, my sister and I told my parents about it, but they didn't believe us. They just shrugged it off as simply as they left it ajar, or the wind pushed it. To this day, I can't explain the events of what happened that night, but I know someone came in and was there.